It's the Ambiguously Blind podcast with your host, a guy that's great at hearing, but terrible at listening, John Grimes.
Hey, greetings. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in and subscribing. Be sure to connect and share with us at ambiguouslyblind.com. Or if you're like me and don't want to spell ambiguously all the time, you can go to amblind.com, amblind.com. There you will find our social media links, as well as merch store, Patreon, and product links that we talk about on the podcast. You will also find episode transcripts like this one. We are going to hear from Francesca Testa, a fellow meningitis survivor. She has an incredible story of overcoming and adapting to life on the other side of meningitis, and how the meningitis experience turned her into an advocate and put that into action. Hey, Francesca, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for having me.
We have a lot in common because we're both meningitis survivors.
Yeah, we definitely are, and blessed to be here and be able to, to be able to share our stories.
Yeah, we are. You were in high school when you got meningitis. Is that right?
I was, yeah. I was a senior in high school. So I was 17, just before my 18th birthday. I was, quite the social one in high school. I was also an athlete. I was a swimmer. And so that pretty much took up most of my time, and, competitive athletics and theater, and, just being able to, be a normal teenager and hang out with your friends. And, this is definitely not something that when you're 17, that you think of something like meningitis, or, you even think about getting sick. You hear stories, but you think that it can never happen to you.
Had you ever heard of meningitis?
Not really. I mean, I think I used to watch a lot of medical shows on TV. I think House was actually my favorite show at the time. And, you kind of hear all these big words, but it was never really something I knew much about. Never really heard anything from my parents about it. I hadn't talked to any of my doctors about it either. At that age, I kind of just went in for my visits, got whatever shots at that point they recommended, but it wasn't anything that you heard in conversation or anything that I really knew about.
You're a pretty average high school student. I mean, you're an athlete, so that makes you a little different than average. But from a health standpoint, you're healthy, you're 10 feet tall and bulletproof, kind of like I felt like I was. And meningitis is nothing on your radar. You're going to the doctor, you're taking your vitamins or whatever, and everything's pretty much normal, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that, you don't wake up one day and expect to have a life-changing event. You're healthy, active, doing everything, that you're supposed to be doing, at 17. So.
And you've stated that you were a swimmer. I think you were a pretty good swimmer. Is that true?
Well, I mean, I was competitive. It was definitely something where at that point in my life as a senior in high school, you're kind of looking forward to college. And, I had been recruited to quite a few schools, and had, decided upon the school that I was going to go to, for swimming, being able to be a scholarship swimmer. After contracting meningitis, I mean, that really kind of changed the course of my future.
Okay, so I mean, I played basketball and soccer and other sports in high school myself, but there weren't any colleges looking for me to come play for them, especially on a scholarship level. So, I mean, you may want to downplay it a little bit, but it sounds to me like you were obviously very active, as you mentioned, and pretty good at swimming.
That was definitely, yes, most of my high school. Yeah, most of my high school life.
Okay, and then everything was fine until it wasn't. You got meningitis, bacterial meningitis. When was that?
It was April of 2006. It was actually right after Easter, right after my family had celebrated. And again, senior in high school, you're getting to the end of your senior year. You're looking forward to prom and, whatever senior trips. And of course, spending the summer with your friends before everybody goes off to college. And, I had been feeling a little bit sick, but, nothing that was very severe. And then one morning I woke up and I went from being a totally healthy, active teenager to, basically fighting for my life at that point. And similar to a lot of others who have bacterial meningitis, most of my symptoms started out just as you would think with the seasonal flu. I had a fever, I was tired, I had body aches, I was a little bit nauseous. And, you kind of just pass it off as, again, I'm 17. Maybe I have a cold, maybe I have the flu. It wasn't until I started to get a very severe headache and an extremely high fever where I was almost at about 105 where, we thought to call my physician. I went in there on a Saturday afternoon. They took my temperature, they sat me down, listened to my lungs, and pretty much said, okay, we think it's the flu. If it doesn't get any better, maybe we'll go for some chest x-rays next week and, send her home, give her some Gatorade and, kind of rest, take a nap. So of course, my mom brought me back home. And later that afternoon, within hours, I deteriorated rapidly. The fever never went away. I had a headache pretty much unlike anything I had had in my life. I had had migraines. We've all probably had a regular headache, but this is definitely different. You can't move your neck. You almost feel like the whole top half of your body is almost paralyzed in pain. And I also had a unique symptom actually, where it's very difficult to associate actually what you are seeing or thinking with what's coming out of your mouth. So I would see my mom and I would call her my dad, or I'd see my dad and I'd call him my mom. And I remember asking my mom and saying, Dad, can you go get my prom dress? Dad, can you go get my prom dress? And of course my parents at that point were extremely worried.
Yeah, I would guess so. That's odd. I've not heard that one before.
Yeah. And it's very odd because you actually know it's happening. It almost feels like you're hallucinating, but you're still lucid. And they definitely attributed that because my fever at that point was still about 105, which anyone, children, teens, adults, having a fever that high can cause hallucinations. It can cause visions. It can cause things like that. But again, we had the reassurance from my physician at that point. Again, she probably has the flu. So I went to bed that night. And that was the last thing I remember before waking up in the hospital, attached to the ventilator about 2 weeks later. The next morning, my mom came in. She saw I hadn't drank my Gatorade, tried to wake me up, and she couldn't. So, of course, you call the ambulance. That's the first thing you think of. But what's the first thing the ambulance driver thought of was actually, oh, she's 17 years old. Maybe it's drugs. And that's the first thing the ambulance driver said to my parents. And of course, my parents know me. Again, I'm a healthy teenager. I'm super, active. I'm an athlete. It definitely wasn't drugs. And then one of the ambulance drivers actually was the first one to notice. I had purple spots all over my body from the top of my hairline all the way down to my toes. And as soon as he saw them, he knew that it was something way more serious than they, had thought I had. So they rushed me to the first hospital. And again, this is 2006. So of course, some hospitals had some, infectious disease protocols, but actually really widespread protocols didn't really come up until post 2006. And actually even some until the Ebola crisis, just a few years ago. So when they brought me to the hospital, they knew something was wrong. You saw them put on masks, and then they actually put me in a closet because they didn't have an infectious disease room. They didn't know what it was, but out of precaution, they did the spinal tap. They saw that it was most likely meningitis, and I was airlifted to Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut because the hospital couldn't treat me. And when I got there, the physicians told my parents I had about a 20% chance of survival. And this was at about 10 a.m. the next day. So you figure all of this happened in less than 24 hours, which is why it's so scary for parents, especially of not just high school, where I'm home with my parents, but for college students, who are away from their families. And, I know that's, similar to your story too, I think, John, right? Where you were away at college when you contracted meningitis.
Yes, I was about 250 miles away from my family when it happened. So my story has several unique and I think miraculous twists and turns that get me to the hospital, and then several things that happened from there too. But yeah, I also was thought to be on drugs. I had a friend of mine found me unconscious in my apartment and called 911, and the ambulance came for me, and they originally thought it was drugs too, and they were pretty adamant with my friend that, if you can tell us what he's taken, we can fix it or make it better. And the guy, I'd known the guy for about 2 years and known him pretty well. And he's like, I don't think he takes drugs. Maybe there's a dark side to John that I don't know, but yeah, obviously it wasn't true, but they thought it looked like an overdose. And I heard the same thing with some other people that I've talked to about meningitis stories about the diagnosis of what it was. And drugs usually comes up because it's at an age where I guess that's, experimental time for kids, and it happens pretty often, but certainly wasn't the case for me. And it wasn't the case for you either.
No. And, I think that's also why, education is so important, and, being able to help, have others recognize the signs and symptoms. And thankfully your roommate, was, kind of got ahead of it and called 911. And in other instances, people haven't gotten to the hospital, quick enough or not had that 911 call being made. And so, it's definitely tough to be away from your parents, when something like that happens. But, thankfully my parents also recognized it and called 911, and talking to them, of course, after the fact, you kind of get that story because you're unconscious. You don't really know what's happening. But of course they don't also tell me what it feels like to be told, that your child had potentially a, 20% chance of surviving through the night. And I don't think any parent or any family, would ever want to hear that. And, I was in a coma for about 2 weeks, and, I was intubated. Thankfully the nurses and the doctors, at the hospital that I was at, were able to do another spinal tap, recognize exactly what that purple rash was, and know that they had to treat it in an emergent way and with different treatments in order to hopefully stop, the spread of it. And I had what's called meningococcemia or septicemia, where the bacteria invades your bloodstream, which is essentially what causes those big purple spots. And in others who have amputations due to meningitis, it's usually because it almost looks like necrosis, and it cuts off the blood flow to your extremities, sometimes even your nose, the tips of your fingers, your feet, your hands, all of that. And that was, their first thought was, we might have to amputate her right leg. So in addition to trying to save my life, they were also trying to, save a 17-year-old athlete's limbs at the same time. And, I'm just thankful that they acted quickly, and that I'm still here to be able to share my story. But even after 2 weeks in the hospital and waking up and still being alive, the recovery from having bacterial meningitis is something that's almost as difficult as, the time in the hospital.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that statement. For me, I was in a coma for about 7 days. So I remember nothing of that, but the fight that our bodies are going through during that time period is tremendous. But from my vantage point, and not knowing any of that, to the waking up and the realization that life is significantly different today than the last time I remember going to sleep. The road ahead was challenging, to say the least. But before we get to that, do you have notes, or did your family or people take notes, recount things that happened in the hospital? Do you have anything about your hospital visit during that 2 weeks, things that were happening? You obviously weren't given a very good chance of survival, and then there were some other things that may have been happening to you with the amputations and other organ failures and things like that. Did any of those things?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, it definitely took a significant toll on my parents. My mom wasn't able to come to the hospital for a lot of the time. And I do have 2 younger brothers. And so, she stayed home with them, and my dad did spend a majority of the time in the hospital with me. But, while I was in the hospital, fighting for, my life and, hopefully not having any of these amputations, I mean, my dad's been able to recount some things for me. And one of the things is that because I was 17, there were a couple treatments at the time that were only available for those who were over the age of 18. Luckily, the hospital I was at, is a teaching hospital. So they actually had quite a few clinical trials. They had a lot of different medications that they had been trying. They had some fellows that were actually working in different infectious disease areas in the hospital. So I was lucky because I was right at the cusp of kind of hitting that 18 mark. So my dad was actually the one that consented to being able to use some of those experimental treatments on me. And knowing that, of course, when you're told your child only has a 20% chance of survival, you're going to try anything that you can. And luckily at one point, the treatments actually stopped the septic shock that my body had gone into. And although it doesn't get rid of kind of the damage that's done from the bacteria, so, those scars or any of the tissue death, it doesn't get rid of that, but it stops it from spreading. So they were able to save my leg. And the rash was eventually stopped because of that. They weren't able to wake me up from the coma. And it took quite a few different folks to come in. And I remember my parents telling me that they called my friends and family members. And I guess probably the most interesting part of the story is they eventually called my swim coach actually to come down to the hospital to see if he could talk to me and see if, that would kind of wake me up a little bit and hopefully, bring me up and off of the ventilator. And you don't really think your swim coach or your coach that's yelling at you every single week in practice is the one voice that you would respond to while you're in the coma, but it actually was. They brought him down and he sat with me for a couple hours, and eventually that's the first person I remember seeing when I woke up. Was actually my swim coach. And so, once I woke up, of course, you don't really realize what happened, but at the same time, you do. And it's a very weird feeling to know that your life has changed, but at the same time, feel like nothing's changed. So, I'm grateful for all the treatment there, but what people don't also think about is what was happening to everybody else in your life while you were in the hospital. And when you have an infectious disease, you have something like bacterial meningitis, it doesn't just affect you. It affects your family, your friends, everybody that you came in contact with. So, being on an athletic team, now all of the athletes on the team, they all have to be treated. And they're typically treated with a drug called Cipro, which is a prophylactic treatment for people who've been exposed. They have to go back into your school. I mentioned that I got sick right after Easter. We had seen my entire extended family for the holiday. So everybody from my grandparents all the way down to my cousins who were only about 5 years old at the time. So I'm fighting for my life. My parents are there trying to make some tough decisions. At the same time, I have my siblings that they're worried about. The community is worried, not just about me, but also about other people because, we don't want to have a community spread. So, so we have some notes to be able to kind of go back and compare on. And one of the things that I really wish I knew, and you don't think about this until afterwards, is I wish I knew what strain of meningitis I had. Because as you start to learn more and you want to educate others and you want to be able to spread the message, learning about what strain you had, would be invaluable to that. But in certain instances, if you're treated very quickly with broad range antibiotics, which some people are when they enter the hospital and the diagnosis isn't yet clear, that can actually impede the results of being able to serotype the spinal fluid when you get a spinal tap. So because they'd given me the broad range antibiotics at the first hospital I went to, they weren't able to serotype me when I was airlifted to the second hospital. They do suspect that I had one of the serotypes A, C, W, or Y, and not B. And there are 5 total serotypes for meningococcal disease.
Yeah, so there's a few things about that were kind of interesting. I think I don't know that I don't think I knew the type either, but from what I've been led to believe, it seems like it was B. You mentioned you were at a teaching hospital. I think you said it was at Yale. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I was also at a university hospital. Where I was going to school was Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. So that was also a learning hospital. So there were lots of other things going on at the hospital for that type of stuff too. So, that's interesting you mentioned that. It kind of got me thinking that maybe there's something to that. Maybe that, played a role in helping understand what was going on with me as well. And also you mentioned that you had to go through what I think we would probably now refer to as contact tracing, going back through all the people that you've interacted with in the last 24, 48, 4 or 5 days or whatever the time period was. So the same thing happened for me too. I was involved in intramural basketball and we played soccer a lot. And so there was teams and I was in a fraternity, people that I went to meetings with and just, hung out with. I was a typical social guy. So there was potentially lots of people that had come in contact with me. And I think I don't know if people were freaked out about it because I just don't know that. But I know that if I were in that situation as being somebody that can come in contact with somebody that had COVID, let's say, I think I would be pretty nervous about, what I know about COVID now, what things could happen to that. So I'd be very interested in getting something to, help stem the tide from that.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting to see, of course, in the environment we're living in now with COVID and thinking back as to what happened, with us, and how, and how that played out in our communities as well, and just our circle of friends. And I think it's hard for physicians and, people have asked me before well, you went to the doctor and they misdiagnosed you, but, what a lot of medical professionals, go through, they don't necessarily see a case of bacterial meningitis ever while they're practicing. It isn't a very common thing. It's not like we're spreading the common cold to each other. It is something that spreads with close contact. And although we know it's more prevalent in certain age groups, again, still some nurses, doctors, even some infectious disease specialists may not see advanced cases of things like bacterial meningitis in their career. So, I don't personally ever look back and wonder why I wasn't diagnosed, the day before. I just know that I think it's important as survivors, as both you and I are, to continue, like I said, to educate others, but also to work with people like nurses and physicians and even medical students in our experiences so that if they ever do see somebody, come across them in a clinic or in an emergency room, they think twice about the symptoms that they're coming in with. And, hopefully that rapid treatment can stop the progression of the disease because it's so fast, which is really what sets it apart.
Yeah, it's tremendously fast. And I think you're right. The education for people and just spreading the awareness of it, but also with the medical professionals, just so that they know that that's, they've all been through countless years of medical experience, but because of the rareness of meningitis, you just want it to be top of mind when certain things come in and look the way they do, that let's not rule this out, or let's remember about meningitis before we move on to other things. Did you know anything, like, I think I've already asked you this, but you didn't know much about meningitis. You didn't probably know anybody that had meningitis.
No, I hadn't. And, I do think it's a point to make sure people know that I wasn't vaccinated at the time when I contracted bacterial meningitis. The vaccine was approved, the initial one, the MenACWY vaccine, that was approved in 2005, I believe, by the FDA. And I contracted it in 2006. And so there wasn't really a lot of talk about vaccines then, just like, there wasn't a lot of talk about meningitis. So, you kind of just know, okay, I'm going to go get a physical before I go to college. And, they'll give me whatever I need at that point. And, I wasn't, vaccinated. So had I been vaccinated, this may have been, preventable. And so, to your point too about going to the hospitals and having medical professionals recognize it, is that, I also want parents and teenagers to know that there are two different vaccines. And that just because you might have the ACWY, the one we normally think of, that's been mainstream over the last, more than a decade, is that in recent years, we now have the FDA approved meningitis B vaccine. And, I know you mentioned potentially being Men B and contracting it in college. And Men B is the prevalent strain typically in college outbreaks and college cases. So I don't want a parent to, walk into a hospital and be like, but my child's protected though. My child's protected. And they didn't know about that Men B vaccine. So I think that component is super important too.
Okay, so now we know you have meningitis. You're out of the hospital. You're probably a wreck and trying to understand some pretty basic human functions or being. What was life like after the hospital, or maybe even during the hospital, the road back home, basically?
It was definitely very tough. And it's hard for someone who is pretty active in their regular life to have to kind of take a step back. And even though I woke up and I was off the ventilator, it didn't mean that the recovery stopped there. And I think, it's really important to talk about, because although we know it's a relatively rare disease, and, we don't necessarily talk about, even if you survive, what long-term effects do you survive with? And so while I was still in the hospital recovering, I couldn't walk. I wasn't able to do anything for myself. I couldn't shower. I couldn't get up to walk down the hall. And I had an extreme headache, pretty much 24/7. And when they finally were able to send me home, I still couldn't walk. And I think that was probably the biggest challenge. I slept on a couch on the first floor of our house for probably about 2 months. And I had a visiting nurse and physical therapist come into my house every other day. And you just lose the ability to do even the smallest things for yourself. Besides the pain of, the recurring headaches and, being able to walk again after having some of that muscle tissue die from the septicemia, you also have the mental side of things as well. And it's kind of coming to terms with how your life is changing. So you have the physical effects of coming home to recover, but you also have the mental and emotional effects of coming home to recover. And so, I think in that moment, I kind of realized that, I don't think my future plans are going to quite end up the way that I had hoped a few weeks before. I spent pretty much, and again, I contracted it in April. I spent pretty much all of the summer, May through August, really just learning how to walk, how to be able to even jog again, and being able to do regular activities, without tiring. And it wasn't just the walking that I had to learn how to do again, but bacterial meningitis also causes some cognitive effects and other physical effects. So I suffered some cognitive impairment and some short-term memory also that I was dealing with at that time, as well as some hearing and vision loss. And at this point, that's pretty much when I decided that I was going to stay home and I wasn't going to go away to college. But I still wanted that to be my goal. And I think that having the one thing that you love to do and that you are really looking forward to getting back to, I think that really pushes you to, to put everything you have into your recovery. And, I fought and I was able to come back and start with a different swim team at a local school, but I was able to do it. Not at the level I was at before, but at least I was able to get back into the pool. And I think that that's one of the things that really saved me during that initial recovery, was at least having that one thing that you can work towards, and that, that you love to do. It was never easy after that. Any sort of rehab comes with setbacks, days where, you feel like you just can't do it like everybody else can. And it's very frustrating. And when you're in college and you're a swimmer, you have a demanding schedule, just like any other sport. You have practice before school, then you have school all day, then you have practice after school. And it's just things like that, you can't necessarily keep up with the same level that everyone's at. And you got to keep working towards it. And I know I mentioned some of the hearing and vision loss, but that impacts athletes greatly. I was never able to hear the buzzer go off when we started races. So I would have to look for the flash of light that the starters let off. And so you kind of adapt to all of these things, but you never quite get over them. And again, sometimes it's a day where it's a mental or emotional roadblock, and other days it's a physical roadblock that, you never anticipated.
Was it difficult to try to see the starter? Or, did you perform lower than you expected because of the start, basically?
Until I was able to kind of adapt to my environment, definitely. It was also only affected one side of my body. So going into, unfortunately, my stay at the hospital, I didn't have really any vision problems. I didn't have any hearing problems. And so having it all on one side of your body definitely makes you kind of move and have to adapt to that. And so there were times where I couldn't hear the starter. I couldn't see the starter depending on where it was at the pool. There were also times where I couldn't see the wall when I was doing flip turns, or where if as you're swimming, it also impacted me if part of my body was moving or turning in a certain way. And the right side of my body was the only side that was out of the water, and you can't see the flags when you're swimming. So it definitely took a lot of adapting, learning how to do stroke counts that other athletes didn't have to do. Learning that if you see a certain line on the bottom of the pool, you know how many strokes you have until you get to the wall so that you don't hit it. So it was definitely a disadvantage. Not being able to hear or see the starter at certain pools, of course, also puts you at a disadvantage. And so going into college, after coming off of a great senior year and not being at the level that you think you're going to be at, is very discouraging. And again, learning all the things that we learn after we have meningitis, that even though we survive, it's also learning that had I had access to the vaccine at that point, again, it could have been prevented. But the one thing that I do try to drive home the point to is I do get asked, and John, I don't know if you get this question, is, if you could go back, would you change things? Or, would you have done anything differently? And, I think with infectious disease, you can't necessarily do something differently, of course, besides maybe get the vaccine if it's available. But I don't think at this point that I would go back. And I think the reason for that is that because even though you've had all these setbacks and you've gone through something that's really challenging, it's challenged me in ways now that I can hopefully pass on in a positive way to other people. It made me a different type of athlete that I don't know that I could have been, had I not been presented with this type of a challenge.
I think I've been asked, or I have been asked if I would go back and do things differently. And really, I don't know that there's much I could have done differently. The vaccines were really non-existent in 1998 when I came in contact with it. So I certainly agree with what you're saying. It's changed me, and I think it's changed me in mostly the positive ways. You deal with you work through a lot of things, and most people, everybody struggles with certain things, and everybody has their own challenges in life. But for a guy like myself who really didn't know much about challenge like I found out about through meningitis. It certainly has made me, I think it's made me a better person. And I think something else that happens, especially because of the age in which this affected you and I and most people, is that we are adaptable. And, the younger we are, the more adaptable we are. So we want to improve. We want to get back. For me, the carrot getting me there, getting me to the finish line of returning was getting back into college. It happened for me in February. I was in the hospital for 21 days and went home to my parents' house for the rest of the semester in that summer. But my objective was to get back into school in the fall semester. So I did. And it was really interesting journey getting back into college, working through all the changes that were upon me. And I didn't know anybody else that had meningitis, I didn't know anybody else that was blind, at least that I could call up and say, hey, tell me about what it's like to do this, or how do you do that? Or so just working through finding the people, finding the solutions, finding different ways to do things, all the adaptations and things that were necessary. I was pretty excited about doing those things. And I think a lot of that was due to my family, who was a very strong influence for me and still is to this day. And my faith and those things really and my friends at school really embraced me and helped me back through the process. But it doesn't happen that way for everyone, and not everybody has the same results that I did. But that's kind of what my experience was like getting back. For you, like getting back in the pool. For me, it was getting back into school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, really, for me, the hearing and the vision loss was really, that was really challenging.
Yeah, I've talked to people that have vision loss through the podcast, and I know somebody that I've talked to somebody that has been blind since birth, and they wouldn't change it because they don't know any different, and they think everything is just fine the way it is. And so that's just a mindset that you either got to be with or you're against, and it's probably not a good way to be against that because it's unlikely to change. So you just got to make do with what you can and see the sunny side of things, and that's generally the way I try to do it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So let's see, we're 15 or so years removed. Is that right? From meningitis. You still have some lasting effects from that? Are things kind of the same as they were then, or have things improved or changed for the worse since 2005?
Well, my vision has gotten progressively worse since I had bacterial meningitis, and it has definitely gotten worse with age. My hearing damage has pretty much never changed since I had bacterial meningitis. But I do still have quite a few cognitive issues, mainly with memory, actually, and some, kind of level of impairment in terms of remembering things, mainly in the short term. So as you get physically stronger, over the years and as time passes, some of the long-term effects and some of the, disability that people experience, that's never going to go away, like you said. And unfortunately for me, the vision is definitely the part of it that has gotten worse with age. For me specifically.
So we kind of have that in common, at least the vision element of things. Something else I think we have in common, you got connected with the National Meningitis Association. And I don't think it was something that you immediately did. I mean, probably you wouldn't roll out of the hospital and go get involved with an organization like that. But you decided at some point you were going to do that. What led you to the NMA?
For me, I got my first phone call while I was in college from Lynn Bozoff, who was the president of NMA at the time. My college had run an article actually in the newspaper related to my swimming and to meningitis. And so Lynn had actually seen that article and gave me a call. And honestly, I wasn't really ready to really talk about meningitis. And I think it was for the reason of maybe just being a teenager at the time, it was kind of like I had it, it derailed my plans, but I'd kind of moved on at that point, and it wasn't something that I really necessarily was ready to go back and tell my story and kind of rehash and bring up, all of those kind of feelings, that you have after you kind of face something, that kind of changes your life. And then so Lynn kind of accepted that. And then a few years later, after I had graduated college, so it was in 2010, she called me again and asked me, we're having a training for some new advocates and we'd really love it if you could come. And so I was like, oh, I'll think about it. And she called me again, and then she called me a third time. And by the third time, I was like, you want to know what? Let's jump in. Let's see what this is about. And, if anything, at least I can meet other people who went through something similar, because, similar to your story, I was the only one that, contracted meningitis at the time. I'm also the only one of my friends or family members or most people you come in contact with, the only one that's ever had it. So I flew down to Atlanta for training in 2010. And ever since then, I've been doing everything I can to, work with the NMA and to work in my community, because the things I learned and the people I met, I realized that it's important to take what happened to me and to make it a positive experience. And the only way I can do that is to share my story with other people and to hopefully use that as an educational point, so that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else in my position, and it doesn't happen to anyone else's family.
Yeah, based on what I know about you, you've been pretty involved. You've done a lot of things with the NMA and been a very good advocate through panels and meeting with people, talking to people, telling your story, talking about obviously the importance of the vaccines. And the NMA has another campaign called the 16 vaccine, which keys into the Men-B vaccine. Is that right?
Yeah, we bring up the Men-B vaccine, but also focus a lot on the second dose of the meningitis ACWY vaccine, as well as other teen vaccines, and why, they're so important. And why the second dose is important of the meningitis vaccine is because, as we know now, years after the first one was approved, is that the efficacy of that vaccination wears off over time. Where it was initially thought to be, have a high efficacy for 10 years, we now know that that's really only about 5. So the reason that it's such a big part of the 16 vaccine campaign is because we want families to know that you need to have the second dose at age 16 to 17 in that window in order to have full protection, whether you're going on to college, whether you're going to a technical school, or whether you're just going into the workforce. It's really important that you have that protection for the full 10 years, and you don't get that with just the first dose. So that's really the crux of the 16 vaccine campaign is educating people that there is a second dose, and their child or adolescent, or you, if you're looking at the vaccine campaign, is that, you need to get it, and a lot of 16, 17-year-olds. And I think that that's one of the hardest things is that, when you're 16 or 17, now you have your license and you have more independence. And, the first thing on your mind isn't, well, when's my next physical, or when do I have to go back to get another vaccine? So that's really a hard group to reach. And I think that that's really a huge part of what we're trying to do in that educational campaign. And I love working with the NMA. I have learned an immense amount, over my time with them as an advocate, and gotten a lot of opportunities to share my information with people where, it could really make a difference. And I briefly mentioned before with physicians and nurses and school nurses and, people that kind of are those frontline folks that are treating, people, like us. And I don't want another family to have to be in that position, like we were in, if there is a vaccine that could potentially prevent it. And I'm also now working towards a career in public health, which I think is really 100%, motivated by my work with the NMA. I now have my master's in public health, and the majority of the work I did there was on vaccines and health disparities, and how we can reach populations that might be uninsured or underinsured, and how we can work with them to, make sure that they get the well-visit care and the vaccinations that they need. But really now I've moved on to legislative work, advocacy work in the policy realm. And I'm going to law school now to hopefully be able to work in public health law when I graduate.
Yeah, let's back up there just a little bit, Francesca. You have such a compelling and incredible story. So not only did you get meningitis when you're in high school and have suffer all the setbacks that we've discussed, and probably many more we haven't even discussed, you go on to college, you knock that one out, you get your master's degree, so you keep on moving in public health, right? Is what you said.
Mm-hmm.
And yep. Now in law school. And I think you're right. It sounds like you might be fueled by at least in part from your experience with meningitis and organization like the NMA to help fuel the fire to keep going there. That's incredible.
Well, thank you. And I think it's really, it's also what I can, offer to others, and, trying to make the world of public health a little bit better if I can. I think when we look towards things like policy and advocacy, I think that one of the things that just speaks volumes to people who are making these policy decisions is to have somebody tell their story and having that personal connection, so that people know that there's a face behind, these diseases, or that there's a face behind this vaccination that could have potentially helped prevent it. I think that message is never lost. And I think that it's extremely important as we work towards improving, public health policy across the country.
And to take another step forward in the vaccine world, you're the co-chair of the Vaccine Alliance of Connecticut. How'd you get connected with those guys?
Yes. So I am currently the co-chair of the Vaccine Alliance of Connecticut with my counterpart, who works with the March of Dimes. So we currently we are connected with other nonprofits in the area. We're essentially a network of public health experts, organizations, parents, individuals, anyone really with a common goal of improving, the health of our communities and the health of our schools and children through, education, public health education, and advocacy. And I actually got involved in that because of my advocacy work with the NMA. A few years back, I was introduced to my co-chair currently, as well as other organizations in public health in the state of Connecticut, through some legislative work that I was doing. And then they asked me if I would like to be the co-chair of this alliance that, we were starting to form in the area. And so, of course, I said yes. And so for about 2 years, maybe a little bit less than 2 years, our coalition's really been working to gain public and legislative support for a lot of our healthy community initiatives, educating the public about the benefits of vaccines and why they're so important. And essentially the alliance kind of started not right before, but, kind of right before COVID hit. So I think now more than ever, it's, been really beneficial to our community here in Connecticut to have kind of a coalition of individuals, but also organizations that are, that really just want to bring that common goal of having a healthy, community, whether that means a local community, your state, the country, internationally. That's kind of our goal here, is to be a source of information. If anyone has any questions or a parent has a concern, to dispel any myths or anything like that surround the vaccine community, and that's why I'm doing it. To me, it's just really important, because I know we can say it over and over again, but if I can help just one family know that the meningitis vaccine is out there and that this is when you should get it. And this is the meningitis B vaccine. And if it's, a couple families that it can help, just having that education, then it's worth it.
Okay, Francesca, that is really a compelling story and some great information. Where is the best place for people to go to find out more about your story and about meningitis?
So we actually have a couple websites. The first would be the National Meningitis Association's website. So they have a lot of great information. It also has advocate stories on it like mine, but also some local information and state information if you're interested about what your state's policies may be. And you can find them at nmaus.org. We talked earlier about the 16 vaccine campaign. If you're interested in that, you can visit the 16. So that's the 16vaccine.org. And the last place we talked about was actually my work in Connecticut. So if you're interested in visiting the Vaccination Alliance of Connecticut's website, it is vaccinatect.org.
Tremendous. Thanks a bunch, Francesca. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for spending time with the Ambiguously Blind podcast. Please rate and write a review wherever you subscribe. And for a complete transcript of this episode, connect and share with us at ambiguouslyblind.com.